It would be impossible to do a 10-second thing with me because I ramble on a lot. It's impossible. Okay, cool. Yep. So today we'll be talking to Tory Stevens, who is the climate fiction creative manager at grist.org, and which is behind the Imagine 2200 Climate Fiction for Future Ancestors project. Tory Stevens, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with just some basic intros as we usually do. Would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners and tell us also about like what Imagine 2200 is about and what it is?
Yeah, so my name is Tory Stevens, and I'm calling in from a small railroad town in Massachusetts, which is on the east coast of the United States. And I'm the creative manager for climate fiction at Grist. Grist is a nonprofit, an independent nonprofit media organization that's actually in its 25th year. So we've been reporting on the climate crisis when it was called global warming, and for 25 years. And we were really one of the only outlets in the news space doing this work. In the last few years, the Washington Post and the New York Times have beefed up their climate reporting. But if you remember, like 10 years ago, there wasn't really many people at their climate desk. So Grist has been doing this for a long time. And we reach a lot of people that are climate scientists, activists, people who care about the planet. But what we recognized is that, we can't talk to everyone, and facts and figures and statistics and research and investigative reports are really good for some people, but other people get their orientation from fiction through stories and climate storytelling and narratives that have take place on different worlds and have just alternate timelines and whatnot. So we wanted to play in that space and talk to people in that space. So we created Imagine 2200, an initiative that right now is solely focused around, or primarily focused around, a climate fiction contest where people submit the story that they think is great and we review it. And we'll get into, how we do that. But essentially, it's a contest, but we have a design of, or we have an idea that we would like to do, just publish climate fiction beyond just the contest, because we receive a lot of stories that don't get published, and we're trying to figure out how to get a lot of really good stories outside of the contest out there. And we can talk about that as well. But essentially, I'm the creative guy behind the curtain that is helping bring climate fiction stories to the world. I used to be a fundraiser. I work in movement spaces too. I have been a resource generator for movement building organizations, primarily in the Deep South. And so a lot of the ideas that I've gleaned and the communities that I've interacted with on the movement side of things that I wouldn't get in the news or journalistic space, I've brought over to this project. Things like care work and healing justice and liberation practices for Black and brown people in the South and fighting against racism and all the other isms that are kind of very present in the Deep South because of the history of slavery and things of that nature. I don't live in that area, so I had to really go down there and do a strong listening tour. But I came away and was able to work with a group of people to bring, a couple $1 million over the last like 8 years. We've moved $7 million to the Deep South. And so through those connections and community that I've built there and engaging folks, I've definitely learned, because every day of my life is not movement building. And those folks, they really have taught me a lot around justice that we've been able to seed into the project.
I want to ask you more on this. What does it mean to bring justice into the space of climate storytelling? And also, in what way, it seems like also looking at the project from afar, hearing you as well, there's this partly it's about reaching people that aren't reached by kind of quote unquote highly data-based or empirical storytelling. But I think there's also like hearing you, there's a real narrative shift as well that this kind of work kind of tries to do. So I'm curious to ask you, why is that narrative work so important? In what ways does the dominant economic system that has led to the climate crisis, does it also try and transmit certain kinds of stories? And why are stories such important tools as well to counter those narratives, but also to open space for other ones? I'm curious to ask you, yeah, why is narrative work so important?
Yeah, so glad you asked this question. I have been focused on narrative work for a few years now, and I saw the power of narrative work in advocacy work that I used to do. So I used to work in the health advocacy world. And so what that looks like is you had, in America, you have these programs, Medicaid and Medicare. And Medicare is for older folks, and it's like insurance for older folks. And Medicaid is for insurance for poor folks who can't afford like the market insurance. And these programs are always under attack by the right wing here in the United States. And so there's advocacy organizations that have popped up to help defend and broadcast and tell stories about why we need to have these programs, who they help. And I was in that work. I was raising money in that field of health advocacy. And there was a lot of narrative work that was being done and strategy work that was being done. And the long held belief in the United States is that Medicare has a constituency. It has a story around, you're not going to take away, like it's easier to take away, sadly, some poor person's healthcare than to take away grandma's healthcare. And that narrative has taken shape, and there's a constituency, and like politicians, will work to protect the older folk because, for one, they show up and vote a lot more than folks that are, working a 9 to 5 or even longer, and they can't make it to the polls. But they're also, even beyond the kind of like realistic, everyday life things that folks have, which makes them kind of for a program or not for a program, there were stories being churned out to kind of, bash these programs and bring them down. But then there was also positive stories to kind of lift them up. And so what I noticed is that there wasn't one for Medicaid. And that was because there wasn't like all this money, like, the older folks who are in their retirement have a lot more money to help with, fund an advocacy program. But so what we did in the advocacy work is we started to push that because Medicaid was under attack. And so there was a lot of story work that was done around like why Brenda. I was the one who was really focused on, let's move away from statistics and figures and research and really just focus on one person's story, how not having this program, whether it be Medicaid or Medicare, would impact their life. That was helpful, but you have to get the word out. For narrative work to work, it has to bloom in 1,000 different places on 1,000 different platforms so that somebody who gets their media from talk radio gets it, somebody who gets it from social media gets it, someone who wants to read a human interest story on like a news site, but is a little bit more about a person and what they're going through in their life. And maybe that takes 1,000 words as opposed to kind of just like a social post that's like a meme or something. But that's the way narratives work and take shape. You need like these 1,000 flowers to bloom. And so to your question around, is the economy set up to kind of like tell the stories, kind of what I read into what you were saying is like, is there someone out there telling the fossil fuel story and why it's so incredible? Hell yeah. Like the fossil fuel companies themselves, but then also the general story of like, I'm not a person that doesn't think that there was no benefit to fossil fuels. There's definitely has been a benefit for society. It's just that we overused and double down, triple down, quadruple down, and we're too tied to this fuel. But there's plenty of stories about someone who was a pulled themselves up from their bootstraps, dug in their yard, got a pump or well going, and now they were industrious, And so there's that aspect, the entrepreneurial spirit. There's the aspect that this is, brought us out of poverty. You look at the United States like 150 years ago, and it's all been run on fossil fuels that has built up these gleaming towers and all this other stuff. So there's narratives out there at work around why fossil fuels are great for society. And then you have all the other people whose interest is involved in it, pushing narratives themselves on, when they go on MSNBC, when they go on Bloomberg, you have titans of industry, like the Rockefellers. Their stories are well known and they're considered like icons and titans, But on the other side of things, trying to like reverse all that narrative that has worked its way into our society is hard. So what I think is we need is 1,000 flowers to bloom on the climate side of things. And I say this all the time, or more recently, is that I think one of the most underutilized, efficient, and effective climate solutions is story work, climate storytelling. And I'm more focused on the fiction side of things because I think there is in the news. I mean, it's not as much as before, but like I said earlier, the New York Times has ramped up their climate reporting just because you can't ignore it. The Washington Post, you name it. If you're a news organization, I mean, even Fox News is getting in on it. They're not doing it from a climate perspective, but they have a whole now weather channel that's like weather events, disaster, and it's like they try to make it exciting and flashy. That's because the climate has changed so much that there's all these things happening. So they're getting in on the story work. They're just not doing the like, let's tell you why, like following the conclusions. And so I think we need a lot more fiction. I sit on the Hollywood Climate Advisory Board, and on that board, one of the other organizations we work with is Good Energy, and they've talked about how in Hollywood they did a study with a university. I can't remember the name of the university right now. Maybe you could put it in the show notes or whatever. I can send it to you later. But they scanned TV shows across streaming sites and movies, all the things that we watch, and they put in keywords like climate change, global warming, heat index, things related to a changing climate. And what they found was a measly 3% of the stories that we consume through streaming, TV, film, all that stuff, and there's so much of it. Like we just had like the awards show here the other day, and like, people are talking about these shows, and like people are really, I mean, this is the land of TV. And I think the world is becoming that way too. We talk TV, but we're not talking about the thing that's the most important existential crisis. So there's a lot so just saying, when I said that this can be an efficient thing, I don't know if Hollywood, if that efficiency extends to Hollywood, but it doesn't matter. I'm convinced that just let's keep it on Hollywood for a second, and then I'll go back to fiction. But in Hollywood, I know there's incredible storytellers that could tell really cool stories about the climate that we would consume. These are some of the most brilliant storytellers that are out there, that have had hit shows. I always say this other thing, which is that what if we had, there's a show with Jim Carrey or a movie from way back that was called The Cable Guy. And what if that was the solar installer, right? Or like the wind farm? Like, to me, it doesn't matter, like the story. And I think some stories would be quite boring if the whole thing was just about the existential crisis that we're in climate. But we need small and big ways to show that the economy needs to shift. And so light touches, like just having Jim Carrey instead of being a cable guy, could have been a solar installer. You could have had like millions of people, young and old, that were like, you know what, that's a job that I want. I want to be a solar installer. I didn't know about that. And so shifting it back to fiction, I think it's an effective way because it's low cost, right? And when you get writers, I mean, it does take a lot of energy and imagination and time, but the cost is cheap to kind of put out a book. It's not super expensive. Or to put an idea out on a blog or just write a short story and submit it or put it into a magazine that collects or curates those. And so I just think we need more of that. And to me, the work of narrative is about getting your idea into the marketplace in 1,000 different places and a lot of different mediums. And I'm kind of an advocate for that. And it's an underutilized climate solution. And I think that's why we're losing the narrative war, because there's all these other narratives out there and we're not countering it or creating a space for people to dream about the world we actually want.
Yeah. So before, up until a few months ago, I had done this consultancy working for a local NGO here in Switzerland. And what I did was look at the ways in which the tobacco industry, which is pretty big here, it has one of the seats here in Switzerland, learned from the fossil fuel industry and vice versa. It's actually the other way around mostly. The fossil fuel industry learned a lot from the tobacco industry because it was a bit older, at least in its scale. And one thing that's interesting and very noteworthy immediately, especially with the tobacco industry, although I think since then the fossil fuel industry has caught up learning those lessons, is that the tobacco industry, for the most part, has stopped saying tobacco is bad for you or smoking is bad for you. They lost that battle in the 90s with the big court case in the US and stuff like that. So what they're doing now is actually positioning themselves as part of the quote unquote solution that they are creating. So they basically say there's a website called, I think it's Beyond Smoke or something like that. I'll find the link and put it in the show notes. By PMI, which is Philip Morris International, which is based in Switzerland. And it's basically, the tagline is something along the lines of like, if you don't smoke, don't start. If you smoke, quit. And if you can't quit, change. And it's the change where they get you. Because the change is actually like, well, actually you can buy those other products that we also produce, vaping and all of that stuff, the no smoke products. And I found that quite interesting because for the most part, the fossil fuel industries, especially if they have like an international audience in mind, will stop saying things like, it should only be fossil fuel. Like they have reduced for the most part their attacks on renewable energy, but they are basically saying, well, you have to have both. And so they're pushing the narrative, if you want, that like this is a transition phase. Of course, the transition is open-ended. It can last 5 years, it can last 50 years, it can last whatever. Then it depends on the conferences that they're having and the audience that they have in front of them, and they know how to cater to their audiences. And the other thing that PMI, Philip Morris International, is especially very good at, I think, and this is one of those things that goes under the radar, is that they're very good at playing the corporate game, essentially, of basically saying like, we are a healthy work environment. We're very diverse. We have like a psychologist on site, that sort of thing, just to make it look like it's just a job like any other jobs, basically. And by doing that, I think they kind of anticipate certain criticisms that may come at them. If they were very open, let's say openly cartoonish and like, what's that movie with Daniel Day-Lewis? Like, I'm an oil man. Like if they were like that, there would be blood, I think it's called. So if they were like that, it doesn't sell that well anymore to be this openly like stereotypically toxic and whatnot. So the product is the same in many ways, is actually worse, and it's much more numerous in the sense that they sell more cigarettes, for example, than they did a century ago, obviously. But the way the message is now quoted, or the product is quoted by this wider narrative, has shifted. So they have always understood that story and storytelling is part of the process of selling something. They've always understood that. There's a very good short, one of those reports that John Oliver used to do on the tobacco industry, And one of them is on one of those Philip Morris USA, because it's Philip Morris USA and Philip Morris International, talking about women smoking during pregnancy. And the CEO at the time said something that today seems very ludicrous and outrageous and insulting, but at the time wasn't seen that way, which is that actually many women like having smaller babies because it was a side effect of smoking, because it makes it easier to go through labor, basically, stuff like that. And that was an actual PR campaign that clearly worked for some time until it didn't. And so my what I find very useful in thinking about like what Grist does and like Imagine 2200 and so on is assume that they are going to die out at some point, because they will. Nothing is permanent. Just as a general rule in the human species, we never do the same thing forever. At some point, we do something else. We need to build for that, or at least we need to, and this is part of the hope building. I would assume. Let's say that in 10 years or in 20 years, and maybe more optimistically in 5 years, the fossil fuel industry collapses, or it's dying out, it's being phased out, whatever it might be. What does the day after look like? And what I like about 2200 is that in many ways, it's for me, I'm very into Star Trek. And there is also this kind of, when you watch Star Trek, it's like, well, obviously we've moved beyond it. This is 300 into the futures. Why are we're not talking about fossil fuels? It's ridiculous. So it's just, well, no, we've moved beyond it. We're in this different thing now. This is not part of the debate. The wallpaper is different. Everything is different. And now this is the world, and that's it. And you kind of take it for granted almost. And I like that kind of mental exercise. So with that in mind, let me ask you this. I'm not just talking to myself here. Why does Imagine 2200 choose hope over dystopia? You've mentioned a bit of that, so let's get into it a bit more. And also, why do you all stress like the importance of cultural authenticity? I find that very interesting as well in climate fiction.
Yeah, the piece around hope is there's a lot of reasons why we focus on hope, but let me start with like it was like a natural thing for us because of who Grist is. I don't know if you know this, but Grist our new tagline is climate justice solutions. But for the longest time, our tagline was something about not being for doom and gloom, right? We were the happy place where you focused on the climate solutions, hope, and opportunities to get us out of this crisis, and the people that are, doing that. We would report on people that are, focusing on the justice side of things. And essentially, we're still doing the same thing. We've just changed our tagline to one that is a little bit more, I guess, grown up, because we've grown up and we're 25 now and we're not 16. So that there was that. We knew that, if we're going to produce a climate fiction initiative at Grist, it's going to have, it's going to focus on climate solutions. It's going to have a lot of healthy dose of justice intertwined throughout the whole project. And it's going to be hopeful. So that was one reason. But the other reason was when I started to do the research on climate fiction and what the genre looked like and what the short stories that were out there are about, I wasn't finding a lot of hopeful stories. I was finding a lot of doom and gloom, disasters, the day after what do you do the day after the apocalypse kind of stories, instead of like, what do we do when we've moved away from fossil fuels? And so we explored this with a whole bunch of people at a retreat, actually, before we launched Imagine 2200, or even had the name Imagine 2200. We had a retreat session where we had some facilitators that were really good at visioning work, and I had never done collective visioning. And we essentially went to this, we were going to go to this retreat space, but a pandemic happened. So the whole thing took place on Zoom instead of underneath the beautiful stars of the spring sky or whatever, with these amazing people from the United States that are focused on climate and justice. And so, but what I found was that through the visioning work, a lot of the folks who had not read widely climate fiction, some of them who came to this are activists, others are scientists, most of these people just are not in the fiction or literary world. They may have heard of climate fiction, kind of like me. When I first started Grist and they were like, we're exploring climate fiction, I was like, climate what? Like, I mean, I guess I could guess what that was because it says it in the name, but I hadn't read any climate fiction books. This is like, I've only been at Grist for 4 years now. So 4 years ago, I didn't even know the term climate fiction. Maybe I heard of it in the news article or something like that, but I didn't really know what it was. And so the group of people that we brought to do this retreat were essentially like me, had heard the term, but hadn't really read much about it. And when we started, the facilitators did a smart thing. They created it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons, but a role-playing type game that I was involved in the co-creation process. So I helped them too, but it was their idea that we should have a band of 4 people go on a quest together, 4 people that don't know each other. We were going to do this in person, but we ended up doing it on Zoom. And the goal was for them to create a timeline from the present day, which at that time was 2020, all the way to 2200. And the goal for that team of 4 people that didn't know each other and from different backgrounds, disparate backgrounds, was to get to a clean, green, and just world at the end. So built in that idea that we're going to get to a clean, green, and just world that has like a hope, kind of like, mantra and feeling, and like just the whole goal is around getting to a healthy, hopeful planet. And then when you see like the timelines that these different, so we put like, there's 20 something people. So there's 5 different groups and they went on their quest. They created these timelines. And when you read their timelines of like the things that we needed to do, not all of them were hopeful, but I think like, there was wars over like the direction of the country on certain timelines or whatever. But in the end, they started to shift towards hope. And even some of them, there was like a shift towards hope after 50 years on their timeline. And so that's like one of the big reasons, just that Grist has this in its ethos. And then when we brought these justice and climate focused or solution focused individuals together, and the goal we had in general, it just had a whole vibe of hope. And so I think the thing that I recognized that we don't do as humans when I was doing this visioning work is that we don't dream about hope collectively or talk about hope collectively. It's like weird. If I said to my mom or my family or someone, my neighbor, like it's like weird to talk about hope with people you don't really know well. And like how often do you talk about, like we're talking about it now as like an intentional, thing that we're doing on a podcast. But if outside of my work, it's hard to talk about hope with people that are like closer to me than like some of my colleagues are, right? So like a part of what I learned in that exercise is that we all need to be actively talking about hope, really going through the layers of what that means for individuals, different perspectives of hope, because I don't believe there's like one sort of hope. If you ask kind of like someone from different cultures in their situation, they're going to say, this is what I think a hopeful future looks like. So with Imagine, the idea is to explore those many hopes, those many futures that we could come to. And yeah, I hope I answered your question, but it was mainly around like kind of the things that I came away with going into a project that is full of hope. And the fact that when I looked at the climate fiction field, I walked out of the thing and was like, oh, so all the stories I'm going to find out there around climate fiction are going to be super hopeful. And then I remembered like, no, they're not. They're like, because I did know that there are these like dystopian stories, and mostly the ones that I knew were like the Hollywood ones that had already like all these like disaster, I figure maybe even the movie's called The Day After Tomorrow or something like that. But,
it is The Day After Tomorrow. Yeah.
Right. That's one of them. And then, so yeah, for me, it was just like really an eye-opening experience to kind of go through this retreat with all these people and have them dream about hope. And just to kind of preview something that also happened there is that a lot of the time people weren't talking about the climate solely. They were like, we need to tackle, like, we're not going to tackle the climate if we still have like systemic racism. Because we can't allow the people who live in let's use America, for example, in the Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, there's a place called Cancer Alley because of all the fossil fuel industry, in plastics that are there. And the people that live there, business doesn't care. Business moves on and got to keep on grinding to get that money at the expense of these people's, health. So I walked away with a lot because people were sharing openly their feelings and visions around what they want out of the future. And that's not something that we do often as people.
Thank you so much for sharing, Tory. I have multiple questions that kind of emanate from what you're saying. So I want to ask two slightly different ones, if that's okay, but we can go in order. The first is just picking up where you were finishing with. Is in Imagine 2200, there seems to be this very, very important intersectional approach that's prioritized. I think especially I love the reference to intersectional characters. So I wanted to ask you one, which the question is, what does it mean to try and seek out and build intersectional stories and intersectional characters? And also curious, what is it with a frame like climate fiction, knowing that so many different cultures around the world understand the climate in different vocabularies and languages, and also understand storytelling in different ways, where even a word like fiction might not make as much sense in a storytelling tradition. What does it mean to be intersectional in the way that you gather stories and look out for stories? And just a final reflection on that, I'm curious, hearing you speak, there's like a lot of what I really appreciate about what you're saying is there's a lot of learning going on and looking back and saying, wow, how much you've grown in the process. And I'm curious how your own practice of hope has changed in the last years as a result of the work you do.
Okay. Yeah. We'll start with the intersectionality and why we call for intersectional characters, because what I've come to learn is that people are intersectional. And the tough part about this world that we live in and this word that we're using to describe people and their particular positionality or situation is that it gets so academic, right? Like the word itself is a turnoff to some degree to certain people, and especially people who I want to reach. So I'll try to break it down in like more simple terms, which is that, like the simplest way to say it is people are complex and have lots of layers, and those layers make up who they are in the decisions they're going to make in life, in what they care about, and how other people react to them, right? So a Black gay man who is living in Georgia is going to have a very different experience than a Black gay man who is living in New York. However, there may be certain, power or like lack of privilege, or even, privilege that they have. Privilege being a man, lack of privilege to some degree, maybe more so in Georgia, being a gay man, right? And how these different, like your positionality in life, me being a Black man versus someone being a white man in where the closest city I live to is in Boston, but we could even say my town Air. It's just different, even after civil rights and all the things that have been done to kind of correct what's going on in America. We all know that situation is still such that there is discrimination and racism. And so all those things that we care about, or I care about, and the folks that run this contest, whether our character, how their gender, how their race, their sex, their class plays out and affects their life, we want that to be shown within the characters in our stories. Because another thing that I found when I did this kind of like scan of stories that are climate fiction stories before, when I was trying to like read up and be like, what is, like, I want to know what climate fiction is that oftentimes, because climate fiction is kind of an offshoot of science fiction, the world building was incredible and really focused on. But some of the characters to me were what I call Lego people, because you could just pop their heads off and like put them, like, it didn't matter that the character, like, if a character's Brazilian or say French, like, you shouldn't be able to pop their head off and swap in the story will still make sense, because like the food they eat, the type of language they're going to use, the way they describe something, the people that are kind of in charge in their country, and like, is it right wing, is it left, is it in between, like the history that is involved with, like, that lives in the people, it was missing, and like so many other things were missing. The layers of a person were missing. And I was like, damn, this story was really good, but I'm a character driven, like, I love good world building, but if I don't have a good character that I care about, like, how is the story, for me, the story is not going to be good. I'm going to say, well, they built the world well, but the story wasn't that great. So we knew that for two reasons. One is we wanted to honor people who have all those layers to themselves, because we didn't see that in the storytelling. We didn't see disabled characters, Black and queer characters. I didn't see them when I was looking through this scan of climate fiction. And so we wanted to make sure that we were reaching those people, right? Like the thing around the narratives that I was talking about earlier, you need this 1,000 flowers to bloom, and they have to bloom in different communities. And so you can't just have a conversation in white world around the climate crisis. It has to happen in different countries. It has to happen in different communities, different affinity groups, folks that feel comfortable talking about something as big as the climate crisis. So that's why we focus on intersectional characters. And we just feel like it's really important to getting the story out there and then honoring the people, to be honest, who are also on the front lines of this stuff. Like some of the folks that had been missing from climate fiction were the people that are living right now. It's not something that's coming in 30 years or, well, I guess now the timeline's faster because it's all jumbled. But, my wife and I live in New England, and 10 years ago, we used to be like, the place that we will move to is Vermont. Vermont is going to be, yes, it will be warmer, but because it's already so cold, it will kind of even out. What's happened recently is all the snow is melting and flooding Vermont, because they have all that snow and they have lots of hills and mountains. And so like nowhere is safe these days. There's all these different disasters popping up. But 10 years ago, and even now, it's more acute with folks that are on the front lines. And so by having intersectional stories, we are honoring and allowing folks to talk about the experience that they're in, and then think through what would a hopeful, future look like for them after they've gone through all that they've gone through and who they are. So that's the piece on intersectionality. And I really do wish there was like an easier word for that, to live, so that we could meet, folks who just don't use these type of academic words to describe the world. I just wish there was something easier. And so the second part of your question, can you remind me?
The second part of my question was around hope, around your own practice of hope, how in these 4 years, receiving and reading through and sifting through all these stories, how has it also transformed maybe your own relationship and practice of hope?
And maybe if you can, if I can add to that, sorry, Daniel, if you can actually give us some, because I know that you have some examples you wanted to share, some of the stories that y'all are working on. That would be also nice to make it more concrete maybe for listeners.
Yeah. And I think like the way that I think of hope now is like there's like a dial, kind of like there's a dial to your stove. You can, and this is the same with like climate solutions or intersectionality or decolonized futures. Sometimes it's dialed up all the way and the story is super utopian and like we've solved so much and everything is working out really great. And then other times there's just little glimmers of hope, right, in the stories. And that's something we're really okay with. Imagine 2200 is not a utopian project. It is a project that focuses on 5 core elements: cultural authenticity, hope hope in hopeful futures, decolonized futures, and climate solutions and intersectional characters. And so what you have is sometimes people really dial it up with the cultural authenticity, but the hope is kind of like dialed down a little bit. And then you may have another story where the it's the reverse. And so that's one thing I've noticed is that just there's you have to be comfortable with different levels of hope that people put in their story, you know, and I'm fine with that. Like every story doesn't need to be utopian, and I still think sometimes those stories are a little bit more realistic in my mind for me. But at the same time, we're totally comfortable with utopian stories that usually the utopian story is like there's still some interpersonal dynamics between the community of people that are like living this utopian dream. And that's like what they're trying to figure out, which is quite interesting. And so for me, I guess the thing, like, I kind of, and I'm not trying to trash Obama, but I have a disagreement with him around the way he talks about hope, possibility, and optimism. It's like this natural progression that human. I know over the course of human history, like, yes, this is not the Middle Ages. Things are better now, right? But I don't believe that just we're just on a trajectory of hope. I think like there's many instances of humans intervening to help push along and make the world better. And I think that's the story that sometimes he's not telling. And the reason I think it, for me, I used to be more on like kind of the Obama thing, like where we're kind of like moving towards a more progressive future, a hopeful future. But if you look at like, it's not this like straight line, you know. It's like often whenever something super hopeful happens, at least in the United States, in the favor usually of people of color, you know, there's a backlash. And so I think like I just had like a little bit more of a superficial idea of hope, and by engaging people, especially people that are on the front lines, in talking with them, like this thing that I think is a little bit weird to talk about hope. You know, you can't talk about it with your neighbor. It's like if I went to my brother and was like, "What's giving you hope, man?" Like I could do that because my brother's pretty chill, but still he'd be like, "What?" Like I don't know. It's just not. It's like an odd. It's just not a regular conversation. And so I've been able to have these irregular conversations, and through that, what I've learned is that you have to be okay with like different people's goal of what hope is. And basically it's made it so that I have a less superficial idea of hope, and it's more durable and it's flexible, and it is, I'm willing to kind of explore it a little bit more. That doesn't make me feel uncomfortable. And that alone has really helped me be like, wow, this is somewhere where I want to put my energy in. Because I think it will pay off for me personally. And if I'm doing it in community, collectively, we can do something about this world. And that gives me hope.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's just funny, before we started talking with you, Dan and I were chatting a bit, and we did mention that movie The Day After Tomorrow that you brought up. And what was interesting about the example, or the reason why we brought it up, was what's interesting about these movies and TV series, but often than not, it's films and movies, is that there's almost no difference. You mentioned the whole Lego characters. Almost no difference if you change the general plot from it's a climate apocalypse, or for example, it's a zombie apocalypse, or it's a whatever. Like it's just post-apocalyptic, i.e., things are bad. And what those things are almost doesn't matter. And that's because in many of those films, certainly true of that one, but I'm thinking, for example, I Am Legend, one I've mentioned a number of times, and other films like of that genre, let's say, it's centered around a hero, a heroic arc of like someone, often male, not always, but often a male thing, is like fighting, you know, against the odds, and will come out of this alive and happy, maybe even at the end of it, whatever it might be. And what's also always interesting, and this is a point I've made a few times, so apologies to listeners who have already heard me say this, But when you watch a movie like I Am Legend, you identify with the main character. You don't identify with like most of the humans that are dead like within 5 minutes into the movie. You're not that random person who was killed in the background. You're the main character, and that is how a lot of those films usually work, because you follow the storyline, even if in the statistics of it, if you want, you're more likely to be that person who's dead within 5 minutes in the background than you ought to be like Will Smith in that movie. And that's in and of itself a testament to like the power of storytelling, is that it can make you believe something that is unlikely, basically. But what's interesting is that what we are kind of led to believe is not we can face adversity as a community in the face of difficult odds or whatnot. There are movies like that, but they tend not to be climate related, and I want more of those. So I like Grist, and I like other projects of that similar vein. And on this podcast as well, we try to bridge the gap between, for lack of a better term, like the fictional world and the real world. On like solar punk, like what would solar punk look like in, I don't know, in Gaza in 100 years? It almost feels obscene to ask it today, given what's happening. But that's kind of part of the mental exercise that a podcast, in many ways, we have the privilege to be able to do that, because we're just talking at the end of the day. I like that. I like that you mentioned also like the difficulties of talking about hope. I get that. I also struggle with it. One thing that I found that helps a bit is reframing hope as a verb rather than as just a thing that is there, something you have or you don't have it. And one thing I found very helpful or hopeful, you might say, is when you don't have hope, you can still participate in creating it. So even if I personally don't feel it right now, others do. And so I'm kind of latching on to what they are currently feeling and also what they're currently doing about it. And that actually helps me to eventually get it back, if that makes sense. And I like that. There is obviously an argument to be made that this is what storytelling is for in many ways. And last point that I'll make, and I know, Daniel, you had a question. I was listening to this podcast, and of course I'm spacing out on the name right now. If I remember it by the time I edit, I'll put it in the show notes. But it's by two Indigenous women in, I believe, in what is currently northern US, southern Canada. If I have the details wrong, apologies. Talking about apocalypse, talking about like even this idea of what it is, what does that even mean? And at one point, either the two hosts or maybe one of their guests, I don't remember, someone on that conversation said that to me, the apocalypse started in 1492. Like with the arrival of white colonizers, basically, in what we now call the Americas. And they mentioned this in the sense, and when they mentioned this, it kind of clicked in my head that like up until then, and I listened to this like a few years ago in 2020, it was during in the early days of the pandemic. Up until then, I used to think of the apocalypse as something that is inherently a future thing, like something that's just to come. And that here, between the pandemic and listening to that podcast, that I was actually talking about the apocalypse as something that actually already happened, and now we're living in the post-apocalypse already. And doesn't mean that we don't have hope, or we don't feel, it doesn't even mean that there can't be a second apocalypse. None of that is taken for granted, but it's just kind of reframing things. And of course, I'm also from Lebanon, from Beirut. And in August of that year, we had the big explosion, which looked very much like an apocalypse as well in and of itself. All of these things got kind of jumbled in my mind, if you want. And that allowed me, I feel, despite me in the beginning, I was kind of resisting that, to see these things as being more than just like a linear thing. Like the past was bad, the present is okay, and the future might be good if you are in the kind of Star Trek universe, or the future is inherently bad if you're in a post-apocalyptic universe. Actually, the future is just, we have no idea. That's the point. It doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. It has not happened yet, by definition. So anyway, a lot of different thoughts. This can be kind of different threads we can put through. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the piece that you just said about the apocalypse not being linear, and this these two Indigenous women talking about the birth of the United States of America, or like the colonists coming to the United States. And there's a Nigerian writer, and I will send you the link to that because I think your audience will benefit from it, where he talks about dystopia in the same way that you just talked about the apocalypse, and how he talks about how the West is, we consume so much dystopian material. And he questions, like, why is that, And he goes, do you think that people who are living an actual dystopia, like right now in like the Delta of Nigeria, he's from Nigeria. His name is escaping me right now. I apologize. But, he talks about how it is nonlinear and there's different people living dystopian, moments right now, that, maybe don't want to go home and cozy up to like a movie that's like about, something that's crappy and how the world has gone bad. And I often think about this article that I read around truck driving in the United States, where there's these facial cameras on you all the time to see if you're sleeping. You have to check in. Like, it has become, so many people are fleeing that industry, and it doesn't pay as much as it used to in the past. And, they're living a sort of dystopia for the folks that really would love to get out of that job, but don't have another skill and are having to check in, sleep on the side of the road, and be away from their family, have facial recognition tell them that they need to pull over now because they are tired, even though maybe they don't feel tired, but the AI told them that they are tired. And it's just like, and then they have to sleep on the side of this road. It just, to me, the whole thing felt really dystopian. And I was like, yeah, this stuff is nonlinear, and there are definitely millions, if not maybe billions of people that need to be liberated from the dystopia that they're living in right now, and I don't mean liberated from like we go save them, but liberation where they have their full freedom and have opportunity to have a better world.
Thank you so much, Tory. We want to ask you, on behalf of all the listeners, for folks hearing this and inspired to bring their own stories, to bring their own visions of liberation, what is the best way that they can participate or get involved in Imagine 2200? How can folks get involved?
Right. So the great thing about Imagine now is that in the first year, it was not something that was guaranteed to be an annual initiative. And so now we know that, like next year, we're going to have the contest. In fact, we're publishing stories, 12 new stories on the 23rd of this month. So next Tuesday on grist.org, on the front page, at the top of the front page, you will see that Imagine 2200 has launched a new collection. Again, that's at grist.org. And the other way to find us is through just Googling Imagine 2200 and the word about. And then you'll find the collection of all the old stories we've published, the collections that we've published. And we've also been publishing stories outside of the contest. We received, like for the first year, we received 1,100 stories from across the world. Second year, 600. Third year, 1,050. And, we've already scored and read those stories. We have judges and reviewers that read and score the stories for how dystopian they are or not, how hopeful they are, how much they have climate solutions. And then when we have a right mix that feels like an Imagine 2200 story, we pass it along to the judges. But what we found is that, if we're having like 1,000 stories submitted, there's close to like 175 that I would say that are just really decent stories. We just don't have the capacity to publish that many. So, but what we did was we found the capacity to publish 6 over the course of the last year. So if you go to Imagine 2200 and About, you'll find our About Me page. And at the bottom of that page, you have all the different collections, the editor's picks. And then even we have some audio stories that we've done where we've turned you can listen to the stories. We have paid voice actors reading the stories, and sometimes they have some horn honking and all that other good stuff. So yeah, that's where you can find us. And I would say that if you want to stay in touch with Imagine 2200 and get an update on the latest and greatest climate fiction stories that we produce, I will send a link to you all. You can put it in the show notes. And folks can sign up. And the thing about it, I would say, is that it's not really an email list like a traditional, it's an email list, but not a newsletter. So you're not going to get like once a week. There's no cadence from us. It's just whenever we have a good story or the collection is launching, or this was to your original question, if when we have our call for submissions. So because we now know that this contest is annual, we are accepting submissions during the submission window. That will open sometime in March, and it's open for 3 months. But I always tell people, like, 3 months to write a short story, if you're really good, you can do that. But it's hard to kind of like come up with a really great story in 3 months. So if your passion is writing, or if you want to try your hand at writing, start now, because we're definitely going to have the initiative open, and you don't have to wait till we say go. You could even work on a story now and workshop it for a whole year and submit it in 2025. So we didn't really talk about like the writers involved in this initiative, which I think is a really cool aspect of this. Which, again, me learning, I was so focused on what we get out into the world. Is it going to be good? Are people going to like it? Is it going to be cool? Is it going to be exciting? Is it going to help people see that clean, green, and just world that we want? The first year I was running this, again, I come from the fundraising world. I was not I actually wanted us to kind of talk about policy and publish these. I was pushing this idea of these bright spots reports. Let's talk about all the bright things that are happening across the world that are related to climate solutions and justice. We want climate fiction. After the visioning session came around to being like, wait, this is brilliant. I love it. So we'll be open for 3 months, and you can submit your story. I think that will be the best thing for folks to do. But for writers, I often tell people, like, workshop this story, have a friend read it, have other writers read it, sit on it. Like, you don't have to submit. Like, if you really want to submit it in the first year, go for it, but take your time and work on it, because ultimately it's not really about winning the contest. It's about motivating people to articulate the vision they want for the future that is clean, green, and just. And so that exercise in itself, to write 3,000 to 5,000 words on what a beautiful world we could have, where we're living in harmony with nature and collectively trying to figure out how do we do this in a way that repairs relationships between people and nature. I think that's just such a beautiful goal that should extend beyond Imagine 2200. And it does, like, people are working on that. But yeah, I just encourage people, writers, to kind of seek out others, sit at a coffee shop and talk about your story with someone else. What do you like about it? Is my character a Lego person? If they are, like, how do I make them not a Lego person, and like more layered and intersectional and more dynamic? So yeah, the writing part is interesting, because like when I first started this, I just thought about is it going to be cool, and are people going to read it, which is important. But we've had 2,800 writers envision what they dream of a beautiful world to be. And I think that in itself has been a really cool endeavor that I just wasn't focused on when we first started this. We are now focused on helping writers. We have a partnership with Clarion West, which is a writing workshop for speculative and science fiction that now does climate fiction. And so when we open up the project this year, we'll offer that as I think it's $100, maybe a little bit more. But if you want, you can bring your story in there, and they'll help you workshop it to, talk about the strengths and weaknesses and things of that nature.
I will include the links that you mentioned. We'll include them in the show notes, and do send me that Nigerian fella as well. I will include that in the show notes. Very much feel like something up our wheelhouse. Tory, I don't know. Is there anything else we didn't get into that you would like to add? I have a good sense for these things. I have a feeling we can do this like semi-regularly. given that it's a yearly thing for one, maybe we'll have you again next year. We'll see how we can organize something. I love, we're a small collective. We do our best, but it's always fun to collaborate with others anyway. So yeah, I don't know if anything you want to add, please feel free. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. This was really fun.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I'd love to do it again. You all are great. And I don't think I have anything else.
Awesome. Daniel, anything else to add?
Nothing else on my end. Just massive gratitude to you, Tory, and gratitude for your work also over these years and uplifting all these visions. And yeah, it's much, much needed work as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I echo that. Grist is awesome. People should check it out, and we'll include all of the links as mentioned. Thank you. Thanks, Tory.